would say that we're an organization based in New York, DC, Boston, and with some offices around the world. What we do is this business of translating research insights into actionable things for policy. That's sort of that's the point on that sort of spectrum of generation of new evidence to actually creating policy that I think as an organization, Ideas 42 sits at and in fact was set up to do. Because the idea that motivated the setting up the organization was that we have these insights into human behavior, which are very interesting, potentially very useful, but there's actually, if you look at the work that academics do, that's not necessarily the setting in which you're going to be able to grapple with the nitty-gritty of how do you take this insight and turn it into something that can actually be used. That's a separate work stream by itself, which needs the academic research, but has to sort of grapple with what people are actually facing when they're implementing things or designing policy. So that's, as an organization, what we are set up to do. And so I want to just sort of, I'm not going to be talking about specific projects in the exact area that, we are focused on today. But I think the point I want to make is, generally speaking, that why am I talking here about sort of behavioral insights or behavioral economics? It's because any of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with, fundamentally at their core, one of the things that they're based on is how people make decisions and actions, right? And so you could take that to any domain and say, if we want to achieve certain policy outcomes or certain things to happen, we need to understand how all the actors in this sort of ecosystem, how do they act, how do they behave, what do they do, what do they decide to do, and so on, right? And so if you think about the issue of very broad strokes of waste management, you could think about certain kinds of decisions and actions that players in the system take, and those lead to certain outcomes, right? So if you're thinking about how much waste is generated, that's the outcome of a lot of people's decisions and actions. It's the outcome of buying decisions, it's the outcome of how you dispose of things, what, when, where, and all of these things. And going even further back, obviously, it's a function of how things are produced in the first place, right? And so what are the decisions that are going into that? And so you're getting these outcomes based on certain decisions and actions that people are taking. And in behavioral science, and especially in applied behavioral science, we find it quite helpful to sort of think of this sort of chain of things going on. That there are certain things that you are deciding, and by deciding, I mean, think of it basically as making a choice, right? So this isn't yet something that a person has done, right? But there has to be motivation or intention behind anything that eventually happens. And then you go from deciding something to an action. So this is an example that I sort of, again, overly simplified example of what might be the decision nodes and action nodes along the point of creating recycling behavior, right? So to get there, you have to sort of decide to do certain things, and then those lead to certain actions that you have to take, which then lead to whether or not the thing happens. And so fundamentally what behavioral science says is, this is typically how we think about decision making, which is, I decide something, I then do it, and I get the outcome, right? That's what I just showed you. But in fact, we know it's much more messy, right? Like if I tell you that linear thing, I think you'd be completely justified in saying, oh, that's way too simple. And that is the fundamental sort of premise behind the application of behavioral science or behavioral economics, is that, in fact, when we're doing that very simple, go from decision to action to outcome, we are missing a huge amount of complexity that actually determines what happens. Now, all of these, this is a general set of, things. I've, picked a few things that fit in here, but you can see that just think about this from the work that you do and think about decisions that people have to make or actions that they have to take. And I think you'll see that you can immediately see the relevance of some of these, right? If I'm thinking about source segregation, right? If I'm thinking about at a household level of what are my behaviors, sure, there is an issue of, is it beneficial? Does it lead to the outcome? But in fact, in doing it, in any given day or even on an ongoing basis, these things might come into play, right? Like, how difficult is it? Is it something that is a hassle for me to do at any given time? What are other people doing, right? What is happening socially around me in this space? And in fact, each of these is sort of what we call a behavioral bottleneck of some sort, right? So if we think about what are other people doing around me, now there's this huge body of research that says, in fact, a lot of our behavior is determined by what we think of as broadly as social norms. What is the acceptable thing to be done that people are doing around me? What do I see other people doing? And because, as human beings, we have to make, literally tens of, hundreds and thousands of decisions in the course of our daily lives, right? So if you were to, take a very economic view of this and say each of us is going to make a completely considered, rational decision about whether or not to do something, then you would take very few decisions and do very few things because you'd spend all your time figuring that out. Now, obviously, those factors are important, but in fact, these factors give us a bit of a shortcut, right? So if I'm trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, and think about, for instance, take a different context, think about when you're using public transport, for example. So you get into the metro, a lot of the behavior that you're going to see from people in terms of where do they stand, do they walk on the escalator, do they try to push people to get in or get out, it's going to be at least partly socially determined. Whatever's happening around you is going to provide a bit of a mental shortcut for what you should do. And so what this sort of thinking about decisions in this way means that you get these two kinds of things. One is you simply don't consider certain options, you take certain suboptimal decisions. So thinking about something like segregating waste, may not have even considered it, may not have even thought about it, may not have even, put that in your basket of options. But equally importantly in some ways is sometimes you've decided to do something or you have formed the intention, but you still see, and it's very, very common across all kinds of behavior, in all kinds of domains, you see this intention-action gap. So I've decided that I want to compost, right? But then there are a few things that need to happen for that decision to be translated into composting behavior on a regular basis, and that may not be happening. And on the one hand, that's very discouraging because you think, here we have people and we've motivated them and, certain decisions been taken, and why isn't it being followed through on? On the other hand, you can think of that as an opportunity. I think as people who do behaviorally informed design, to us that it represents a bit of an opportunity. We say, okay, well, if the basic intention is there, but it's not happening, what can we do to fill that gap? What can we do to make it, in some ways, more easier, more intuitive for people to actually do this? And so the reason for thinking about all of this, particularly the context of waste generation and associated issues, is that a lot of these things, which do apply more broadly, especially to sort of environmental or sustainability-linked behaviors, are very relevant to this issue. So, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but essentially think about, the fact that, for instance, something that I do isn't necessarily a function of an immediate decision that I'm taking right now. It could be the function of habit, right? So we have pre-existing habits that determine how we behave in certain contexts. And if we can't, we have to sort of change those habits, right? If we can't change the habit, then we're sort of stuck there. On the other hand, it's an opportunity to disrupt that habit and potentially create a new habit. And what's nice about habits is once you have them, if they're the right ones, they can be very helpful in achieving the outcomes that you want. I haven't seen an experiment on this particular issue on, say, waste segregation or disposal, but I've certainly seen stuff on even where do people put their waste. And it's, do you litter or do you not litter? And there's, it's remarkably consistent across cultures and across societies that this is extremely socially influenced. So if you're starting with a littered space where other people are seen to have littered, that is giving you mentally the license to continue that behavior. And I think, as someone who grew up in Delhi, I always think back to the first few times that I used the Delhi Metro when it first opened in 2002, and there was a lot of concern that, given what people's habits are in the city in general, that this is soon going to be a very messy space. And actually, that didn't happen. And that didn't happen, I think, for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the investments that were made in cleaning and in keeping it tidy. But, the behavior of users is a critical part of this. And I think what you would have observed as a regular user is that the very different kind of behavior when it comes to littering that takes place on the metro versus the same person going overground. And I think it's not all, but some of that is, what is the environment you're in? What have others done? So if others are not littering, then your own tendency is to hold back. And I think I remember this early incident where I actually saw this literally happen, where somebody stopped a child, her own child, from throwing a chocolate wrapper after he had finished on the train, but we happened to get off at the same station and we walked out, and then the child threw it, right? And so here you are. It's not so, fundamentally, we tend to attribute these behaviors to how we are as people. And of course, how we are as people is a part of it. But a really big part of it is all of this environmental stuff. So if you can sort of change the cues and the things that people are getting from around them, you get a very different kind of outcome. Other examples, there are, very, very small hassles can deter people from doing really big actions. And so, even when the cost of doing something is actually very small relative to the benefits that you get from it, as human beings, we are extremely good at procrastinating and delaying, right? So if it's something that doesn't have to happen today, it's very, very easy for us to say, I'll do it tomorrow, and then I'll do it tomorrow, and this sort of continues. And I think, I'm sure everybody in this room probably has some experience with this in terms of things you have to do for your household, for instance, which are not like, the world is not going to end if you don't do it today. So think of how long it sometimes takes for that to happen. Or even when you have to do something which is really important, and you do it right before the deadline hits, right? Like, you have plenty of time, you could plan it better, but it doesn't happen. So there is this sort of thing. So the nice thing in some ways from all of this research is, people are, I showed you that slide about how messy decision making is. It's true, people are complicated, but the nice thing is that people are complicated in at least partly in predictable ways. So every time we go into a new context, we don't have to completely learn about people afresh. We do know certain principles that can guide us. And the nice thing is that once you know what those principles are, you can design ways to actually counteract some of these things, and that these things can be quite small but can have big impacts, right? So I'll show you a couple of examples. But the critical thing, and I think is, we talk a lot about sort of, we're talking about data and evidence, is you've got to do this systematically, because even though the behavioral principles are translatable across contexts, how they manifest themselves in a particular situation or a particular issue is going to be different. So like Ashish said, I can't take something that worked for a different issue or a different setting and translate it like as is, right? It's useful because it tells me about something that works somewhere else, but I would still need to spend some time investigating the context and evaluating it. And I want to give you a couple of examples of work, and also just sort of go back to this question of how do we use data and why is it important. And if you think about, I showed you this graph before, of this slide of like the stages in which you go through a problem solving process. And in thinking about defining a problem, you need data, right? So Ashish talked about where we have data and where we don't. And that is critically important, because if we want to know, for instance, as a behavioral person, if we're thinking about waste segregation, I want to understand what's the scale of the problem, what behaviors would actually make a significant impact on that problem, right? Because there could be certain things that we could ask them to do or find ways for them to do, but perhaps they're not enough, right? And so often you're in this process of trying to figure out, well, I can't tackle everything, because we don't have either unlimited time or resources. So we have to prioritize. And in prioritizing, we need to know what's happening. So here we're looking at this work that we did with a city in Costa Rica, where, the critical thing, they want to work on water, fair enough, but what is the current state of water use? Is there scope to reduce? And then we look at, well, they're consuming about a quarter more than the average. So it is a city with relatively high water consumption. So there's some scope to do something there, right? And so you have this definition issue, and then of course data is incredibly important evidence in generating evidence of impact of what works, right? As as behavioral scientists, for example, or any kind of policy intervention designer, you will have your intuitions, you will have what the literature tells you about what could be a useful intervention. But then you really have to sort of, if you're interested in whether this is changing something on the ground, you've got to focus on measuring the outcomes in some way. And you gave a nice example of that, Ken, in terms of we have this intuition that pollution shortens people's lives. But we need to find a good way to be able to measure what that impact is and quantify it. And data is incredibly important here. So we look at what we did in this Belen case is we did a bunch of interventions that were basically leveraging this idea of social norms. And they were trying to tell people, and Ashish mentioned that for certain things, you have neighborhood-wise data about how much is being generated. Now that is really critical, because when we have neighborhood-wise data, we can do this. We can actually tell people, hey, your neighborhood is producing this much on average. You, on the other hand, may be producing more or less. Or your neighborhood is producing more than the neighborhood next to it, which is a very similar profile. And you see what that does is it creates a little bit of incentive or pressure, social pressure among people to say, well, if we genuinely believe that, for instance, using too much water is a bad thing, then why am I using more water than my typical neighbors? What is it? What could I do differently? And that can spur behavior change. And what is cool is, of course, that if you do this in an experimental setting, you can actually get quantifiable measures of impact. So in this case, we're saying, okay, you do this, you tell people this, they change their behavior, and there's a persistent and consistent reduction in water use in this particular setting, right? And then you have some ways to kind of quantify what that might mean, which again, to go back to the example of air pollution, it's incredibly important to be able to tell people what their actions mean in terms of something that makes sense to them. One of the foundational insights of this water study was that, water bills tell you in some unit, right? So it could be cubic meters, or it could be this many gallons or whatever, right? Nobody who's receiving that has the slightest idea of what that means, right? You tell me you use this many gallons of water, I'm like, what's a gallon? If you tell me that is the equivalent of this many buckets, or whatever the relevant metric might be in a particular setting, that makes a lot more sense to people. So even if we can translate some of these things into things that people understand and can say, oh, okay, I get it. And when you tell me that I'm using like 60 buckets of water a day, that sounds like a lot, right? Maybe I should be able to do something about that. So I think I have very little time, so I'll just skate over this, but just to give you an example, another short example, is that, again, the scale of the problem. This is a US study in Chicago, actually, of all places. And we worked with the city there to see, what can we do about discouraging the use of single-use plastics. Now, this is something where, in our country, this is also a problem, but we might not have the kind of data that was available in this case. In this case, there was a fair bit of data, so we could see, okay, listen, this is the scale of the problem, this is what's currently happening, and we know that it's an issue, and so what you can do is you can sort of then start to investigate, okay, what are the drivers of this behavior? And one of the drivers of this behavior we found was that there's nothing cueing you at the moment that you're thinking about using a plastic bag to even consider what is the impact of my decision? Could I do something differently? And so what you end up is that there are a lot of these kind of behavioral things going on around you which reduce the likelihood that you will even take the right decision in this regard. And we ended up trying to raise the salience of the cost of bag use and give people the sense that actually this is not something that is socially being kind of considered as acceptable as it used to be, and in that way to reshape people's habits. And what ended up happening in this case was a very small charge that was levied on people. So 7 cents, which is a tiny amount of money, considering, say, you're at the grocery store, you spend $30, $40, $50. But what you find is it actually was really effective. So even that tiny tax that was put on the bag, what it did was it repeatedly forced people to feel like, oh, why am I paying the 7 cents when I could have just brought my own bag, right? And over time, what it did was it reduced the number of people who took these bags. It increased the likelihood that you came with the bag. And once you have that bag, you're not gonna, it becomes a part of your routine, right? And so you can actually really change, and some of these are quite remarkable figures, right? If you think about, there's a really sharp drop in how many people are using plastic bags. There's a really high rise in the number of people who have now started bringing their own reusable bags. So the impact of this over time is going to be quite large. So I'll end there in terms of the substance of this, but I think this has just been, a sort of, in some sense, very high level. But I hope that as people who work on a specific area and specific problems, you can begin to see that thinking about who are all the people, what are the things they need to do, and what are the sort of relatively easy, quick ways we can find to try and push those buttons so that there's a higher chance that they actually do them, could be a useful thing to think about along with everything else. So, thank you.